All right, welcome to this monthly call. And let's start with the topics. So the first one I wanted to discuss is the new internationalization feature, which we have available now. Let's see. So with the new web page, we now also have an integration with this Webpage service. Where you can see we have now 8 languages supported, and overall about 6,500 strings. So if you go to the starting page, you can find the individual ones, and also sign in works easily with GitHub. And we got quite a few contributors already. And then you can just make your pick. And I think you can also request a new language, which also already happened. And everything then works by, let's see, I think here's no, we usually then have a bot opening a PR, which updates the translation files for us, committing us to respective user. And if the account is connected from GitHub, you will see this is also correctly attributed. So this is the current state, which we can use for the web page, and which we can also use for FPM docs. So there's an organization which I started here and applied for as an open source project for hosting. If anyone of you have an account, I think I can also add you to the administrators if you have to do anything, if you want to do anything here. So just let me know. But other than that, these are just the PO file based ones at the moment. But Webplate overall seems to support more. This is the current state. So the web interface works quite well. If you check this, and I'll quickly show you how this works. You can select a string, and you will get the string. If you're logged in, you can also have it automatically translated by an automatic retranslator. You can copy translation, and then you can decide where you want to edit it or not. And you can accept it. Or you can also just suggest it and have somebody else review it. And it has this neat editing here checked. So this is the current state which we have for our localization effort. So if you want to give it a try, let me know if something doesn't work as expected.
Yeah, looks great. Neat tool.
Yeah, it does look better than these PO files.
Yeah, it's based on the PO files, but exports them in a better editor for those. So it's still the same. It's still the same infrastructure which we used in the beginning, but now with a better front end.
Yeah, well, it was sometimes a bit difficult to keep track of what the what string you were actually editing.
Mm-hmm. I think the only issue which we might have is that we, so the limit which we currently have are 10,000 strings. And we have with the web page and FPM docs, we have now 6,500, which is already quite a bit, but the web page is of course quite huge if you consider all the mini books which we have. So it's a reasonable amount, and we are still within the hosting limit. So we just have to wait where we get approved for free hosting. If not, service is somewhat expensive to buy. I don't know where we have the possibility to finance this already, or we have to see whether there's an alternative we can use. We could host it ourselves, but still then we have to figure out how to get the server for this. So let's hope that we can get a free hosting for Fortran. And if not, we will see.
I think that the hosting stuff and all these considerations are starting to come up, and would be good enough excuses, I guess, to start considering applying for NumFOCUS or something like that, because now it's starting, like it looks like we need to start applying for paid hours or getting our own servers or getting some time in general.
Yeah, I guess I would talk with Andre on this. He already got a Fortran there. If you can give us some hints on the application, and then we can try to set it up. Do you know by chance when the next application period is closing?
January 14, I think. So they have 3 per year, if I recall. And the first one was mid-January, and then the next one was either mid-April, and then there is one now, and I think that's it.
Okay.
But it's been a while since I read the webpage, but from what I recall, it is the stage 1 is in January, stage 2 is later in the year. I'm not sure you can enter in any other stage other than stage 1.
Okay. Yeah, we should check. I think it's worth to try it now.
Yeah, I think we have enough critical mass to get the application to NumFOCUS through in a timely manner, so like as an organization. And we have enough stuff to demonstrate that there is a need. But again, we're going to have to do the work. But I think that's fine. It's not going to be that much.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this. So does the translation work only on so the translation happens on the HTML stuff or the Sphinx docs, but because we have Sphinx docs, right?
Actually happens on the PO files which you generate.
Oh yeah.
So the web page is so the source is there. They are getting processed by our GitHub Actions. They are pulling in the translations. And what this website service is doing is discovering the PO files which we have checked into our repository. And it won't update them automatically if we change the source. So it's still a manual step that somebody has to run the text target and check in the update for the PO files. And then they will be found by WebLate, and the strings will be updated accordingly.
I see. I was trying to think of things that are like for cases where we might not have the PO files, or it might be slightly different.
It supports more. It supports more formats.
Yeah. I was thinking of the translation that happens in Visual Studio and probably other extensions where it's not like it's JSON technically.
Yes, we started with something like this for the Fortran lamp page when we still were in the Jekyll one. There we had, I think, a YAML-based format where you would put in the string as a key, and then the translation for the respective one, which is more or less the same as if you do it with a JSON one. So you basically have a huge map where you put all the strings in, or keys to the strings, and then the translation, and then you would do the text replacement. So this is a more or less standard format. And I think Visual Studio Code extensions are common enough that they are supported. But I have to check. And then we only have to figure out how to make Webplate discover those translation files, and then we should be able to translate them by this means.
Okay. Yeah, it looks very cool. And the quota is 10,000 strings in total, or is it per month or per annum?
It's in total.
Oh, okay.
So we have quite a lot of strings from the web page, because we have accumulated quite a lot of resources on Fortran now, which is a good sign. We might be able to reduce it a bit. I don't know if we can get rid of some of the generated strings, which are not really translatable, but are still captured. But other than that, I think we will stay, even if we reduce it, we will stay probably with 5,000 for the web page. I mean, consider the mini books and consider the intrinsic man pages, which we now have.
Yeah, no, I think we should find, like, address the underlying issue which is we're starting to grow enough that we might need other ways to, like, we might need to start buying resources for certain stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we're gonna hit that limit in a bit. So like if it's not the website, it's gonna be FPM, and if it's not FPM, it's gonna be VS Code, and if it's not VS Code, it's gonna be stdlib. Like we're gonna hit that limit either way.
Yes, I mean, this is something to consider going forward with this project, is whether we are able to write bindings to get text and translate the output from FPM, which would which would provide a localized experience when running FPM. I mean, if you run FPM from your localized operating system in your localized IDE, and then have to, I mean, you can localize your compiler output from your Fortran already. So why should we stop with FPM? If you can read the documentation in your native language. So this might be something we want to reach at some point. So I tried it recently with Toml Fortran. You can write bindings, but for a library, it's much more complicated. And in FPM, we don't have the capabilities which are needed to make it work robustly at the moment. But in principle, yes, this is, I think this is something we want to do at some point.
Okay, quick. I found the NumFOCUS stuff. I'm putting it in the chat. The dates are January 15, July 15, and October 15th for round 1, round 2, and round 3, respectively. You have to scroll at the very end to find the stuff. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so so we should aim for getting it in at beginning next year.
Yeah.
All right. You will have a look what's needed from our side, and then probably open a thread in the discourse where we can discuss the application. And yeah. All right, I guess So any more comments regarding the localization of the web page and the FPM documentation? Is there anything more to tell about the VS Code localization?
Not really. It's just I looked into it, and we need to do manual. By default, it's manual translation to the languages.
Okay.
I think there 18 languages are offered.
So I guess
so
a good
we're gonna have to outsource the community.
so I guess a good
sorry.
start would be to translate it in one language. I mean, if it's string replacement, this first translation can even be English, because you would you have to identify all keys and then make these replacements. So even the first language we are trying to support will behave like any other translation. And then we can see whether if we import a repository in WebLate, if it automatically discovers that it's dealing with VS Code extension, and or maybe look around which other projects are on WebLate, and maybe already use this technology.
Yeah, I think we might be able to automate it. I don't really think it's very scalable. If we have to, whenever we make an API change, we, at least to the user settings, we have to request 18 people or how many languages we support to update the documentation. But yeah, from the looks of it, the most basic example, it has manual translation.
Okay.
Again, it's minimal what we need to translate. So it's like the descriptions of the settings. So it's nothing really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I'll get started with it in the next month or so. Yeah, but I think that's all there is to it.
All right. So no further comments to it. Let's talk about the plans for modern Fortran version 4.
So I've gone ahead and added FYPP support for Fortran, and that works okay. So the next target, I guess, is the issues are slightly intermingled, because other compilers do not support on the fly processing, so like passing stuff from SD in. So we're going to have to create caches, and then we figured out how to do that caching in the correct way. So that's fine, and that should be resolved relatively soon. And if I share my screen, the rest of the issues are okay. Oh, I might have a bit too many screens open. So the rest of the issues are, yes, so that is the FYPP linting, and adding walkthroughs, which is effectively tutorials for people to get either set up with in their Fortran environment, which is it's markdown effectively, I think, something like that. And the language translations, syntax highlighting, and then for FYPP, which it's going to be a bit of a pain. And then one of the important bits is I figured out how to do proper integration with FPM. So when I say proper, I mean not offer a proper build task that runs in the background, and like it's a proper VS Code build task or build system, I guess. So I have an idea on how to get started with that. It will probably be buggy as hell in the beginning, but yeah. We've already done some of that integration, but not with FPM, with Python and pip. to install packages. So it's not that different. And then it's the other stuff that we're adding is Fortran. So to introduce it to the users as a linter, not as an actual compiler. So that's fine. And am I missing something? Yeah, I think that's the general number of new things that are happening in the V4 release. Yeah. Anything else you would like to see? So like we've improved also logging and colorization and all these things, but these are minor improvements relative to FPM and FYPP.
Is there anything needed from the FPM side to make it easier to support it in modern Fortran?
As far as I can tell, no. The real pain currently is creating the UI. So writing the build task, so the actual thing that calls FPM and runs in the background, that's fine, because you can effectively treat FPM as a shell program, which is what it is. But the user interface, so which is the thing that will be on the side that will identify the build targets, that is going to be slightly tricky, because traditionally, I mean, the only other application that does that in VS Code, as far as I know, so there's probably more, is CMake. So it's going to be slightly confusing going from a very deterministic build approach that people have to follow right now to the FPM where the targets are hidden away and they're in their own directories. But again, the caching should help because we don't have to worry about that.
So as long as you can read from standard input, read from standard output or pass things to FPM, you should be able to access most of the information. So FPM supports something like list functions, which can give you all the targets it supports. So if you want to run something, you can call it with -- list, and it will return you a list of all available targets. You just have to pass this.
And the output of that is it's not some serialized format, right? It's not TOML or JSON.
At the moment, it's just strings in some ASCII format, so they are meant for human consumption. But of course, we could also generate this output as JSON and pass it back. I mean, we have the complete model, which we can partially dump in some tree format, which is also not helpful because we have to parse it again. At the moment, it's not complete. But we could add something like an option which activates a machine readable printout and then pass everything. So it's only the only thing required is to define what the information needed is.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess that goes into the UI, and more importantly, it brings the bigger question of, do we want a separate extension in VS Code for FPM? So CMake is not part of the C++ stuff for a good reason, because it's not just used for that, but it integrates perfectly between the two because they're both made from Microsoft. In theory, FPM is not a Fortran only builder, right? So like I've built Metis and parameters with it, which are C programs. So I guess, do we want it to be part of FPM? Do we want it to be part of modern Fortran, or do we want it to be its own thing that we make users install? Like we can force them to do it as a dependency.
So is there a situation where you would say, I want to start VS Code and just run FPM I mean, I don't want modern Fortran. So is there a use case?
If you're using C, I guess, if you're using FPM for C, or yeah,
Yeah,
I guess.
no? Which I did in the which I already did. So yeah.
So, but again, like, okay, maybe we can, there's going to be a bit of boilerplate code. And okay, we have all the infrastructure to do that technically. So we've registered the organization and done all the stuff that we need to do with regards to publishing extensions with Microsoft. But it might be a bit of a pain to launch another extension at this moment. So I guess it's more of a question in the long term, what would be the best thing to do?
I mean, is it easy to separate FPM at some point from modern Fortran and make modern Fortran optionally depend on it?
Yes.
Then I mean,
we're gonna write it that way. So I'll make it as an API, like as a completely separate thing that is like a plugin. And there's no interaction between the current extension and, like, the current extension doesn't do anything with regards to building and compiling. So yeah, there's not going to be any mix-up. So it's a completely separate aspect that we will be addressing.
I could only see an issue since the plugin itself is called linter when it's installed. It would be unexpected to have it work as a build system. So which would more in the long term have it as a separate project, that we have FPM build support, and then we have the general linting IDE support.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends. So how much effort is it to have another repository? How much more time does it take to keep two projects in sync?
Yeah, that's fair, actually. Yeah, so it really depends on how good our testing is going to be. Hopefully, we're good at writing tests in general. So, like, things don't tend to break. But for now, I think I'll do it inside VS Code in Modern Fortran. And at a separate moment, probably, if there is a need for a standalone extension, we will make it a standalone extension. Sorry. That sounds reasonable, I think, right?
Yeah. I guess it's something we can do for the moment.
Yeah.
Any further comments on this topic? If it's not okay, if it's not the case, then I had another item for the agenda, which is regarding quickly share my screen. So I recently opened an issue for discussion stdlib, which is about supporting serialization formats. And we have a couple of libraries supporting JSON. We have a couple of bindings for libraries supporting YAML. We also have Toml Fortran, and they all roll their own data structures. So whatever you do, if you have your application written with Toml Fortran, and then you want to produce JSON, you have to transfer the representation from JSON Fortran, from Toml Fortran to the JSON Fortran library. Or if you're reading something in YAML and then want to produce it as JSON file, then you still have to do this transfer, which can be quite wasteful depending on how large the data structure is you want to copy. It might also not be easy, because if you have a huge format like YAML, you might not have all the data types available which you need to serialize. And then you have to think about what do you do if you have a data type which you can't represent in JSON. So since we have standard lib and we in the future will have all the data structures, might be an option to have a module like standard lib JSON or standard lib Toml or standard lib YAML for this purpose, which produce something after you load this file, which you then don't have to care about whether it came from Toml file or JSON file. And then can just work with the usual standard lib types. For this to work, I made a short list of things I would need to do it with Toml Fortran. And for JSON, we would only need a list data structure, which we don't have yet. We have a map. So having a list would already enable all the JSON libraries to support a common format. Not having a datetime format wouldn't be too too much of an issue for Toml support. We could just ignore this and maybe serialize as a string, and then later add the support. Yeah, and so a suggestion would be then have something like an API which gives you a module called standard lib Toml. We have an interface, just Toml load. And then you can load from a file or you can load from string. And you have to get some generic value where you have to decide how to represent this, whether this should be class polymorphic or whether we have some thing in standard lib which represents generic types. And of course, we have to decide on the error reporting. But in general, this should be sufficient to load any file if we have the data structures to represent them in standard lib. So the question is, so should we target this for standard lib to make it possible in the near future? Because I think this would at least make at least the usability of standard lib as a compatibility layer between different IO libraries much more powerful.
I think this is a great idea. I'm still going through the GitHub issue, but in terms of maintenance for stdlib, I guess it will need to be somewhat in sync with the JSON and like the Toml libraries, right? If I've understood correctly.
Yeah, the idea would be to only define the interface and not implement this in standard lib, because having those implementations here would be quite of an issue, but basically enable IO libraries to be standard lib compatible.
So the interface, if there's a change in the interface, I suspect we will have to change stdlib as well, right?
Yes. I mean, as long as we're in experimental, we don't guarantee the stability of the interface. But so far we haven't broken any backwards compatibility with the interface, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just trying to understand what will be inherited. I think this is a very cool idea and definitely making dealing with JSON and TOML a lot easier in Fortran.
So I just want to make sure I understand the idea here is that you want to you want to encourage the IO libraries to be able to produce the standard lib types.
Exactly.
Not necessarily that they have to use them internally, but just that they be able to operate with them.
Exactly. So if
Okay, that's reasonable.
So as a user, I could start writing in JSON Fortran and then maybe switch to another JSON library as needed, and I don't have to care. I mean, I also could switch them formats. So as long as they are compatible enough, but I could keep the same logic working on standard lib types.
Okay. It's an interesting idea. I think it's probably worth exploring. I think, yeah. I'm tempted to say that there's some functionality that you'll lose in the interchange, but for some cases that might be okay. And so that'd be reasonable to try this out at least.
Yeah. Do you want to limit this to the interface, or should we also provide within stdlib the data structures that you can use to fill in whatever values come from these files?
I mean, if you can, so if you can build a map in standard lib, the idea is that if you want to write it, you can call any JSON library which implements a standard lib JSON, and you should be fine.
Mm-hmm.
So reading and for reading the same thing. So if you read it with a standard lib JSON implementation, you would get a standard lib format, and you wouldn't notice anything from the external library. So right now we can only build maps. I mean, this would be sufficient. We could just assume that arrays are just make everything associative arrays, and then just make the indices keys.
Mm-hmm.
Then we would already be able to transfer the data. It might not be that convenient, but for the things we usually store on a list, they are not a real Fortran array, but more generic types. So it might not really matter that much.
Mm-hmm.
It's worthwhile indeed to work out how this would go in practice.
Yeah, I mean, one idea to look into this, because this is a common request which we have in the discourse, that somebody wants to try an IO format and looks for a library. Recently had a request for a YAML format. And yeah, if you could support this in standard, we would also expand on the functionality which we have. Then we would have to support a list and a map and other things which are needed for the data structures.
Yes, like I said in the chat, we do have linked lists.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the implementation is also quite good. The only thing that is missing is the documentation and the specs, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think that's indeed missing, but that's something I could take care of.
Okay.
I was the mentor last year, together with Milan.
This would be great if you could get this linked list into standard lib. I think we would, together with the map, gain a lot of needed functionality.
I'll work on that.
Yeah, thank you.
By the way, while we're talking about YAML and JSON and that sort of things. How should duplicate keys be treated? Do you know? I couldn't find anything in the documentation, and I ran into that the other day.
Depends on the language. I think in JSON you're allowed to have duplicate keys. This is implementation dependent, whether they are ignored or stored all. In TOML they're explicitly forbidden. I'm not sure about YAML.
Okay.
Whether it's specified there where you're allowed to have duplicates, is they explicitly forbidden if you can recover all of them. Means kind of like if you think about XML where you can have multiple entries with the same name and then they just become a list.
Okay.
I think most languages make it difficult to deal with duplicate keys if you're trying to use some of their built-in data structures. Like for example, if you're using a Python dictionary to implement your JSON parser, you can't store multiple names.
No,
multiple.
That was
right?
actually the context in which I found out that duplicate keys are indeed a problem, and it will force me to think really carefully about the sort of data structure I want to store in such files.
So I posted a link for JSON. It's a bit of a nightmare to figure out, but basically, they should be unique, all depending on what you're reading. Like just treat it as that being the case.
I believe the JSON standard says that it's still valid JSON syntax if you have duplicate keys.
Yeah.
But what the parser does with those is implementation dependent.
Yeah.
Right.
Basically.
So that's certainly something you shouldn't rely on them. Okay. Right. Thanks.
If not having the implementation standard lib would kind of save us from worrying about these issues, then the library is as compliant as it wants to be, or can implement any extensions. Questions if we run into an extension we can't represent. We then have to make a definition where we can say, okay, you can provide this data structure as a map. Then all the keys have to be unique. Then you can't store multiple entries. Or we would have to define if we give the freedom for the implementation to maybe create a list with all the values which is found. I don't know how else you would represent this.
You'll end up in a situation where the implementation that you're using starts to leak through in the behavior of the data structures that you receive. Right? It's like you're making this attempt that I'm sharing this like interface without relying on the implementation, but it's almost impossible, right? There's subsets where it works, but it's like at some point you'll hit this point where you thought you weren't relying on the implementation, but it turns out you are.
Yeah. Well, even if the parser doesn't make trouble when you come to a duplicate key, you don't know whether it will take the first or the last one.
Correct.
So,
or do something strange like start storing all of the values as a list instead of the original value, right?
Precisely. So you expect a key, but you get a list.
Right.
And that's not going to be a happy situation either.
right? Where it's like the file I gave it had duplicate keys where each entry was a number, right? But now what I get back is a list, even though like so you end up with a weird situation, and those kinds of edge case behaviors are rife for the possibility of you end up somebody's using the stdlib interface to interact with this JSON library, but because of this behavior, now they rely on that implementation. And so if they wanted to switch, well, now a different implementation isn't going to do that, and now the code that they wrote doesn't work correctly anymore. Right? So you're like you're creating this false sense of security of trying to separate yourself from the implementation, but it turns out you didn't actually achieve it.
Okay.
Yeah, this is indeed a valid point. Question is whether it's worth to think about implementing the formats itself in stdlib, or making very specific request on how data structure should be transferred.
I think it's okay to say to define these data structures like a map or a list or whatever in stdlib and encourage implementations of like JSON or YAML or whatever to provide an interface where you can accept and return these data types, but not make any claims as to this means that you're not relying on their implementation. It just means that like if you happen to have a map and want to print it as JSON, any library should in theory be able to do that. Or if you're using a JSON implementation and you want to pass a data structure to something else, like you want to get a representation that is a map, that you can do that, but that doesn't necessarily say anything about what the actual structure of that map is.
Yes, probably first the easier way to go. We can see how it turns out.
Yeah, it will certainly be easier to discuss the merits if you have something more concrete that we can just play around with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's worth a little exploration, I think, but I wouldn't expect everything to go perfectly.
Well, even something imperfectly perfect would be fine.
Uh-huh.
I think as long as we cover the most used, so which is no dupes, like no duplicate keys, I think that's fine. That's what people expect in general. Other than that, I think we will spend too much time developing something that will probably not be used very often. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for the input on this discussions. If there are no further comments, I would close this topic. We have 10 minutes left for our monthly call. Is there anything anyone wants to bring up? So if that's not the case, then I will close the call.